I'll have your license before Christmas price. Count on it. Dr. Fletcher Vane's voice carried across the sun-drenched hallway of Hargrove Medical Center, loud enough for the nurses at the station to freeze, loud enough for the orderlies to suddenly find the floor fascinating, loud enough for everyone within 30 feet to understand exactly what was happening to the tall, composed man in the white coat standing at the elevator. Dr. Barnaby Hurst didn't turn around. He pressed the button, adjusted the sleeve of his navy scrub top over his dark dress trousers, and exhaled once through his nose. Slow, measured, the same breath he used before cutting into a human brain. 3 complaints, 3 investigations. 3 times this man had tried to bury him, and 3 times the board had come back with the same word: dismissed. Barnaby stepped into the elevator and finally turned, meeting Vane's flushed, furious face as the doors began to close. That was a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, a trauma bay down the hall would be fighting to keep Vane's 17-year-old son alive, and Barnaby Hurst would be the only neurosurgeon in the building. Welcome to Frost Folk Tales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The overhead fluorescence of Hargrove Medical Center ran the full length of the 4th floor corridor like a river of white light. And in that light, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December, the silence that followed Dr. Fletcher Vane's threat was the loudest thing in the building. Nurse Yuki Tanaka stood at the nursing station with her eyes fixed on the chart in her hands, her pen hovering above a line she had stopped reading 3 seconds ago. An orderly named Marcus pressed his supply cart against the wall and exhaled through his teeth so slowly it barely qualified as a sound. 2 residents who had been mid-sentence about a potassium level stopped speaking entirely. Everyone in that corridor had heard every word, and every one of them understood, with the specific, helpless clarity that comes from watching injustice perform itself in broad daylight, that there was nothing any of them could do about it right now, except witness it. The elevator doors had already closed. Barnaby Hurst was gone. The hallway resumed its professional hum with the careful collective effort of people who needed to keep their jobs and still had to live with themselves. A negotiation that corridor had hosted many times before and would host again. Yuki Tanaka uncapped her pen, wrote the time in the margin of her notepad, and said nothing to no one. Barnaby Hurst, for his part, had already moved on. Not because the words hadn't landed. They had. 3 years of this man's calculated aggression had not made him numb to it. It had simply given him practice at metabolizing it quickly, converting fury into function, because function was what saved lives and fury, untended, only consumed the man holding it. He rode the elevator down 2 floors, stepped into the corridor of the neurosurgery wing, and by the time he reached the first patient room on his morning rounds, the only thing visible on his face was the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had somewhere more important to be inside his own mind than in Fletcher Vane's. Room 412 held a 53-year-old man named Gerald, who had presented 4 days ago with persistent headaches and mild confusion that his primary care physician had attributed to stress. Barnaby Hurst had looked at Gerald's imaging for 45 seconds and identified a meningioma the size of a walnut pressing against his frontal lobe that 3 other physicians, including a senior attending, had initially characterized as an artifact of the scan. He had been calm about it. He had been specific. He had pulled up the images on the display board in the hallway and walked the residents through exactly what he was seeing and exactly why it mattered, and not one of them had spoken while he did it. Not because they were afraid of him, but because the quality of his attention was the kind that made a room go still. Gerald was doing better this morning. He was eating breakfast when Barnaby Hurst appeared in the doorway, and he pointed at him with his fork and said, "There he is." The man who found the thing nobody else found. His daughter, seated beside the bed, stood up to shake Barnaby Hurst's hand with both of hers. He checked Gerald's pupils, reviewed his overnight vitals, answered every question the daughter had written on her notepad, all 7 of them, and left the room with the same unhurried stride he'd entered with, as though Gerald's gratitude was its own complete thing and required no performance in return. The residents scrambled to keep up with him down the corridor. This was Dr. Barnaby Hurst in his element, and his element was not a title or a corner office or a reputation that preceded him into rooms. His element was the work itself, the specific, irreducible, life-or-death precision of neurosurgery. And he had built his capacity for that work across a lifetime that had not made things easy for him and had not apologized for it either. 1 floor above, the atmosphere was different in every possible way. Dr. Fletcher Vane's cosmetic suite occupied the northwest corner of the 5th floor, and it had been designed with the deliberate luxury of a private spa. Warm wood paneling along one wall, recessed lighting softening the overhead fluorescence into something ambient and flattering, a curated collection of framed credentials arranged beside the door at exactly the height and spacing that communicated achievement without appearing to try. Vane was mid-procedure when his surgical assistant, a careful young man named Elliot, made the mistake of mentioning that the 4th-floor residents were apparently talking about Hurst's diagnosis of the frontal meningioma that 3 attendings had initially missed. Vane did not look up from the rhinoplasty he was performing. He let 2 seconds pass. Then he said, "Medicine has a brand problem." His voice was conversational, almost philosophical, as though he were discussing a hospital committee agenda item, rather than something he had decided on a long time ago and returned to often. When people can't tell the difference between excellence and the appearance of excellence, institutions suffer, standards drift. He paused, made a precise adjustment, and continued. Certain people, certain profiles, lower the ceiling, not through malice, just through being what they are. You understand that, Elliot, or you're too young. Elliot said nothing, which was the correct answer. Vane finished the procedure with the smooth efficiency of a man who had made his work routine by choice rather than circumstance, and had confused that routine for superiority. He stripped off his gloves, moved to the window that looked out over the hospital's sunlit courtyard, natural light flooding the glass at mid-morning, and checked his phone. 3 messages, one from his wife Diane about their son Colton's school project on ocean ecosystems, one from a private attorney he kept on retainer, and one from Eugene Whitmore's assistant, confirming a meeting for 2 o'clock. He allowed himself a small private expression that Elliot, thankfully, could not see from across the room. The 2 o'clock meeting lasted 41 minutes. Eugene Whitmore's office was a glass-walled corner room on the administrative floor, and the afternoon sun came through the skylight above it at an angle that made everything inside look more important than it was, which was, Barnaby Hurst had always thought, probably the point. Whitmore was a careful man, careful in the institutional sense, meaning that he had survived 17 years as chief of staff at a major medical center by understanding that the truth and the official record were 2 different products and treating each with appropriate professional distance. He was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous, a cautious one. At 4:30 that same Tuesday afternoon, Barnaby Hurst received a page to report to Whitmore's office. He went immediately, because he always did, because there was a version of himself that believed showing up promptly for difficult conversations was a form of dignity. He knocked twice, entered, and found Whitmore standing behind his desk with the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed an unpleasant thing and has not yet decided how much of the rehearsal to use. On the desk, centered with the deliberate placement of something that was meant to be seen as soon as a person entered the room, was a single sheet of paper bearing the Hargrove Medical Center administrative letterhead. Whitmore gestured at the chair across from him. Barnaby Hurst sat. He picked up the letter without being invited to, and read it. It was one page. The language was institutional and careful. The grammar of bureaucratic cover. Sentences designed to communicate consequences while diffusing accountability across processes and reviews and procedural necessities. What it said, stripped of its protective vocabulary, was this: effective immediately, pending an administrative review of case assignment protocol. Dr. Barnaby Hurst was suspended from premium surgical case assignments, complex procedures, high acuity cases, the cases that required the sharpest mind and the steadiest hands in the building. His cases, the ones he had spent his entire life training for. He read it once. He set it down. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the faint sound of the hospital operating below them, like a living thing that didn't know or care what was happening in this office. Barnaby Hurst looked at the letter one more time. Then he looked at Eugene Whitmore, who had chosen to remain standing, which was its own form of answer. He asked one question: who requested this? Eugene Whitmore's hands folded together on the desk. His eyes moved to the window, the afternoon skylight flooding the glass, the courtyard below bright and indifferent. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He cleared his throat. His eyes moved back to Barnaby Hurst's face for exactly 2 seconds, and then found a middle distance, the kind that men occupy when they have made a decision they cannot look at directly. He said nothing. The silence lasted 6 seconds. Barnaby Hurst counted them, because he counted everything. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a question has been answered by something louder than words. He stood, straightened the front of his navy scrub top, and set the letter back on the desk precisely where he had found it. "Is there anything else?" he asked. Eugene Whitmore shook his head. Barnaby Hurst walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, not for effect, not for drama, but because there was something he needed to hold for exactly a moment before he walked back into the building he had given everything to reach. He thought about his mother, Loretta, who had mopped these floors 20 years before he operated in them. He thought about the word dismissed. 3 times, same word, same board, same man behind each complaint. He thought about Gerald in room 412 pointing at him with a fork, and about the walnut-sized thing that everyone else had missed, and about the fact that excellence was not, in the end, something that a letter on a desk could touch. He walked out, down the corridor. The overhead fluorescents ran their full white length toward the elevator, and in that light, Dr. Barnaby Hurst moved the same way he always moved, with the controlled, unhurried authority of a man who has made peace with storms and knows that the storm is never the last word. He did not know yet that Thursday was coming. He did not know about the car, the highway, the impact, the boy. He did not know that in 47 hours, the same man who had just refused to meet his eyes would be standing in a corridor, asking him to do the only thing he had ever been asked to do that mattered more than his own survival. He did not know any of it yet, but the building did. The building with its fluorescent corridors and its glass walls and its humming machinery of life and death had already decided. The rooftop garden of Hargrove Medical Center sits 11 floors above the city, and at 12:43 on a Tuesday afternoon, it belongs almost entirely to the sky. Natural light pours down through the open air in wide, generous sheets, catching the edges of potted boxwood hedges and the pale stone of the garden benches with the kind of clarity that makes everything look newly washed. Dr. Barnaby Hurst sits on the center bench with his white coat folded neatly across his left knee, his navy scrub top crisp despite the morning he has already had, his dark dress trousers pressed into a clean line at the ankle. His tablet rests against his thigh at an angle that should be uncomfortable but isn't, because the MRI on its screen has commanded his full attention for the last 22 minutes and he has not moved once. The scan belongs to a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Adeline Okafor, admitted yesterday with progressive left-sided weakness and a headache she described as feeling like a stone behind her eye. 3 colleagues had reviewed the imaging and arrived at 3 different conclusions. Barnaby Hurst had looked at it for 4 minutes during morning rounds and written a differential that stopped the resident team cold, not because it was complicated, but because it was so precisely correct that it left no room for argument. He is reviewing it again now, not out of uncertainty, but because this is simply how his mind works. He does not half-do things. He never has. His phone lights up on the bench beside him. The screen reads 17 missed calls. Most of them are from numbers he does not recognize, and the 2 he does recognize belong to journalists at publications that cover hospital administration and healthcare policy. Someone has talked. The privilege suspension is no longer a quiet institutional matter. It is becoming a story. Barnaby Hurst looks at the screen for exactly 2 seconds, then turns it face down on the bench and returns to the MRI. He has been here before. Not in this specific configuration of trouble, but in the general territory of it, the place where the work he has done is not enough to protect him from the work someone else is doing against him. He knows this terrain the way a man knows the neighborhood where he grew up. He was 18 years old the first time he walked these corridors with purpose. Not as a patient, not as a visitor, as a shadow. His mother, Loretta Hurst, had worked the custodial night shift at Hargrove Medical Center for 11 years by then, pushing a wide mop through the fluorescent-lit hallways of the surgical wing while the building breathed around her in its late-night rhythms. On the nights when his high school schedule permitted it, Barnaby would meet her here at the end of her shift. He would arrive at 11:30 and wait near the service entrance, and for 30 minutes before she clocked out, he would walk beside her through the corridors she was finishing. He watched everything. The surgeons who arrived for early cases, moving through the building with a physical authority he could not yet name but could feel. The way the hospital organized itself around them, orderlies stepping back, nurses straightening, the whole institutional weight of the place parting like water. He watched and he catalogued and he said nothing to anyone, but in the silence of those late-night walks beside his mother and her mop, something in him was making a declaration. He told himself he would be one of them, not like them, one of them. Loretta Hurst had not asked him to become a doctor. She had not asked him to become anything except honest and hardworking and steady, which she had demonstrated by example every single night she laced up those work shoes. But she had also never once suggested that any ceiling he saw above him was real. That was not a speech she gave. It was simply the architecture of how she moved through the world, and he had been watching it his entire life. At Whitmore Medical School, he had carried her with him like a compass. The study carrels on the 3rd floor of the Whitmore Library became his second home. His notebooks, color-coded by subject, his index cards arranged in stacks that other students would stop and stare at, not because they were excessive, but because they were so clearly the product of a mind that was in love with precision. He finished every examination first, not occasionally, every single one. His professors began to ask him to stay after class, at first to challenge him, and then simply to talk, because talking to him about neuroscience felt like talking to someone who was already practicing it in his mind. His brother Garrett drove 3 hours every other weekend to bring him food, their mother's cooking, packed into containers still warm from the drive, rice and beans, baked chicken, the cornbread she made in the cast-iron pan that had belonged to their grandmother. The cafeteria stipend that came with Barnaby Hurst's scholarship covered breakfast and not much else. Garrett never mentioned this. He would arrive on Saturday mornings in his old blue sedan with the containers stacked on the passenger seat, and they would sit together in the small apartment Barnaby shared with 2 other students, and Garrett would eat and talk about his biology students at Lincoln High, and Barnaby would eat and listen, and for a few hours, the weight of what he was building would settle into something that felt manageable. He met Fletcher Vane at orientation, September, a Tuesday. The lecture hall was full of first-year medical students trying to look like they belonged. and Fletcher Vane walked in looking like he had been there before, which in a sense he had. His father had attended Whitmore, and his grandfather before that. He was handsome in the way that money produces handsomeness, well-rested, well-fitted, the kind of ease that comes from never having had to calculate whether you could afford to be in the room. He had found Barnaby Hurst in the crowd with the unerring instinct of someone who immediately identifies the person most likely to be competition, and he had extended his hand with a wide, pleasant smile and said, "May the best man win." The words were cordial. The smile was cordial. The eyes were something else entirely. And Barnaby Hurst, who had been reading rooms since he was old enough to walk beside his mother through a hospital corridor at midnight, read them in 1 second flat. He shook the hand. He said nothing except his own name. He went home that night and opened his anatomy textbook and studied until 2 in the morning. And he did not think about Fletcher Vane again for a long time, because Fletcher Vane was not the point. The work was the point. It always had been. The rooftop door opens with the soft pneumatic exhale of a weather seal releasing, and Dr. Fatima Diallo steps through it carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who has been looking for him and is not entirely surprised to have found him here. She is in her trauma attending coat, white, long, worn open over deep green scrubs, and her stethoscope hangs around her neck the way it always does, present and unself-conscious, like an extension of her. She sits beside him without asking, which is the thing about Fatima that has always made her his closest friend at this hospital. She does not perform consideration. She simply acts. She holds out one of the coffees. He takes it. 17 missed calls, she says, looking at his face-down phone. 18 now, he says, without checking. Fatima wraps both hands around her cup and looks out over the edge of the garden toward the skyline. The light is generous up here, spreading across the stone pavers and catching the chrome of the garden furniture in small, bright points. She lets the silence run for a moment, in the way that good friends do, giving it room to exist before she fills it. The timing was never random, she says then. You know that. He does know that. The first complaint had been filed 3 days after Barnaby Hurst successfully performed a 9-hour resection of a brainstem glioma that had been declined by 2 other neurosurgeons as inoperable. The patient had walked out of Hargrove Medical Center 11 days later. The complaint alleged falsified outcome reporting. The board dismissed it in 6 weeks, but 6 weeks is a long time for a story to move through a hospital. The second came during the period when the New England Journal of Neuroscience had published his paper on cortical mapping innovations, and his name was appearing in places that had nothing to do with Hargrove Medical Center. The complaint that time alleged improper consultation conduct. The patient involved, a retired postal carrier named Mr. Theodore Ames, had not only refuted every element of the claim but had written a 4-page personal letter to the board that Barnaby Hurst had never read and did not want to. The board dismissed it. The reputational residue remained. He times them for maximum visibility, Fatima says. When your highest profile. When the fall would be the most spectacular. That's been the board's conclusion every time, Barnaby says. 3 times. 3 times dismissed, she says, which should mean something more than it does. She turns to look at him then, directly, with the steady attention that is its own form of argument. I've been keeping records, she says. Dates, timestamps, who was present, what was said. I have the hallway incident from last Thursday documented in writing, signed, with 2 witness confirmations. Barnaby Hurst sets his coffee down on the bench. Fatima, I know. I told you not to. I know what you told me. She does not raise her voice. She does not need to. And I did it anyway, because someone in this building should be paying attention to what's happening. And I have decided that someone is me. He looks at her for a long moment. She does not look away. This is the thing about Fatima Diallo. She has a moral steadiness that matches his own without competing with it. And in 11 years of working together, he has never once been able to move her off a position she has already decided is correct. He has tried exactly twice. He knows better now. When it matters, he finally says, "You'll know." "Yes," she says simply. "I will." They sit in the sunlight for another 10 minutes without speaking, and the comfortable weight of the silence between them is its own kind of evidence about who they are to each other. When Fatima leaves, she takes both empty coffee cups with her, and the rooftop returns to its Tuesday afternoon quiet. His phone screen lights up again. This time the name reads, "Mom." He has been avoiding this call since this morning, not because he does not want to hear her voice, but because he knows with complete certainty what the conversation will cost him in terms of maintaining his composure. And he has a 3 o'clock case. He picks up the phone. "Hey, Mama." "Don't hey Mama me in that voice," Loretta Hurst says immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I'm having lunch." "You're not eating." "I can hear it. When you're eating, I can hear it." "What's wrong?" "Work stuff. Nothing I can't handle." The pause on her end of the line is the particular pause of a woman who spent 11 years mopping the floors of the building her son now operates in, and who therefore understands more about the architecture of that institution than most people with medical degrees. When she speaks again, her voice is measured and dry and precisely targeted. "Baby," she says, "I raised you better than that lie." The laugh comes out of him before he can stop it, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind that reaches his eyes and unclenches something in his chest that has been closed since yesterday morning. He presses 2 fingers against his forehead and laughs, and somewhere in the warm, ordinary sound of it is the entire story of who Barnaby Hurst is, the boy who walked hospital corridors at midnight, the student who ate his brother's home cooking over anatomy textbooks, the man who has built something extraordinary out of pure, relentless devotion to the work, and who has never once, not for a single morning, lost sight of why he started. "I'll call you Sunday," he says, still smiling. "You'll call me tomorrow," she says. "Sunday," he says. "Thursday," she says. "Good night, Mama." It's 12:50 in the afternoon, Barnaby. He hangs up, still smiling, and for a moment the rooftop holds it. The skylight broad and clean overhead, the city stretching out in every direction below, and Dr. Barnaby Hurst exactly where he has always been, precisely at the center of everything he earned. His tablet screen is still lit with Mrs. Okafor's MRI. He picks it up, checks his diagnosis one final time, and confirms what he already knew. He is correct. He always is. There is a particular kind of man who believes that excellence in others is a personal insult directed specifically at him. Dr. Fletcher Vane had spent 17 years perfecting the art of disguising that belief as professional concern. He was very good at it. He was, in most respects, very good at most things, except the one thing that mattered most, which was being better than Barnaby Hurst. And that limitation had curdled inside him into something that no longer resembled ambition. It resembled obsession, and obsession, left undisturbed long enough, stops being a feeling and becomes a system. Wednesday morning, the overhead fluorescents in Hargrove Medical Center's East Corridor blazed at full strength, the kind of institutional white light that flattened shadow and tolerated no softness. Dr. Fletcher Vane walked it at 7:14 a.m. with the stride of a man who owned the floor beneath him. He wore a crisp white long-sleeve dress shirt beneath his tailored white coat, the Hargrove Medical Center emblem stitched in navy thread above the left breast pocket, charcoal trousers pressed to a clean crease. His hair was combed back. His badge caught the light. He had the composed, pleasant expression of someone who had decided, years ago, that the performance of reasonableness was the most effective weapon in his arsenal, and had never stopped sharpening it. He had a rhinoplasty at 9, a brow lift at noon, He was in no hurry. The doctor's lounge on the third floor was mostly empty at this hour. A resident nursing bad coffee near the window, an anesthesiologist reviewing charts in the corner. Chief of Staff Eugene Whitmore stood at the counter, spooning sugar into a ceramic mug, tie loosened slightly. The particular gray of a man who had been carrying administrative stress for long enough that it had begun expressing itself in his posture. Vane poured himself a coffee, moved to stand beside him, and the conversation that followed was so practiced it barely qualified as conversation at all. It was surgery of a different kind. "He makes people nervous, Harold," Vane said, his voice calibrated to the exact register of collegial concern. Low, unhurried, absent of anything that sounded like malice. "I hear it from the residents. I hear it from the attendings. He operates outside his lane, and one day that kills someone. You know it. I know it. The board knows it. But nobody wants to be the one to say it because he's—" And here Vane let the pause do the work that the words couldn't. "Well regarded." Eugene Whitmore stared into his coffee. He was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous. A cautious man who had learned to mistake caution for wisdom, and who had spent so many years managing institutional optics that he had forgotten how to distinguish them from institutional truth. He made a non-committal sound. "The review process exists for a reason," Vane continued pleasantly. "No one is above it." The resident near the window turned a page. The anesthesiologist did not look up. Vane finished his coffee, set the mug down with a quiet ceramic click, and left the lounge as unhurriedly as he had entered. The whole exchange had taken 4 minutes. This was how it was done. 3 years earlier, the first complaint had arrived at the board's desk in a manila folder of unremarkable appearance. The allegations inside it were not unremarkable. Dr. Barnaby Hurst had allegedly falsified a post-surgical outcome report on a craniotomy case, the complaint claimed, obscuring a complication that had resolved only through the intervention of a consulting physician. The language was clinical, precise, sourced, footnoted. It looked like due diligence. It looked, in other words, exactly like something Vane had spent considerable time constructing to look like something it was not. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. 2 independent attending physicians reviewed the full surgical record, the post-op documentation, the consultation notes, and the patient's subsequent imaging. The outcome had been verified accurate in every particular. The complication referenced in the complaint had been documented, disclosed, and resolved within standard protocol. The complaint was dismissed without prejudice. The letter of dismissal was sent to both physicians. When it landed on Vane's desk, sitting on top of a week's worth of correspondence he had left unopened, as if he could delay the verdict by avoiding the envelope, he read it once, set it down with a deliberate flatness, and his jaw tightened in the way a trap tightens when it closes on nothing. 14 months later, the second complaint arrived. This one concerned alleged improper consultation conduct, a claim that Barnaby Hurst had pressured a patient in a neurosurgical consultation to refuse a referral to another specialist, effectively cornering the patient into a procedure Hurst had a financial incentive to perform. The complaint was detailed. It named dates and room numbers. It was, in the vocabulary of institutional bureaucracy, robust. The patient in question was a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Adeline Park, 63 years old, who had been referred to Barnaby Hurst for evaluation of a lumbar disc impingement. She had apparently not been informed that a complaint had been filed on her behalf. When the board investigator reached her by phone to request a statement, she spent 11 minutes providing one without being asked twice. She then followed up with a 4-page handwritten letter to the board's executive chair, describing in careful detail the clarity, patience, and extraordinary care with which Dr. Barnaby Hurst had explained her options to her, including 3 separate occasions on which he had encouraged her to seek a second opinion before making any decision. The letter arrived in a lavender envelope with a small sticker of a cardinal in the upper left corner. It was entered into the record. The complaint was dismissed. The letter of dismissal landed on Vane's desk on a Tuesday. He read it, his jaw tightened. He stood and walked to his window, which overlooked the hospital's east parking structure, and stood there for a long time, looking at nothing. The third complaint was filed 8 months ago. It was the most dangerous of the three, because it attacked not Barnaby Hurst's documentation or his patient relationships, but his fitness to practice, and it planted a seed that, even if the plant never grew, left something in the soil. The allegation was that Barnaby Hurst had performed a 7-hour posterior fossa surgery while under the influence of a controlled substance. The complaint cited behavioral observations from an unnamed colleague, slowed verbal responses during pre-op briefing, unsteady gait in the scrub room, and what was described as abnormal affect during the procedure itself. The investigation that followed was the most thorough in Barnaby Hurst's career, and it was thorough because the allegation demanded it, and because the board had no choice but to treat the filing seriously, regardless of its origins. Toxicology screening was ordered. All witnesses present during the procedure were interviewed, including the anesthesiologist, the circulating nurse, the scrub technician, and 2 residents who had observed from the gallery. Surgical footage from the OR's overhead recording system, installed 18 months prior as part of a quality assurance protocol, was reviewed in full by an independent surgical ethics panel. The findings were categorical. No substance was detected. Every witness, without exception, described Dr. Barnaby Hurst's conduct during the procedure as focused, precise, and commanding. The surgical footage showed a 7-hour operation performed without a single deviation from protocol, including a particularly complex reconstruction of a posterior cranial nerve cluster that the ethics panel noted, in their written review, as technically exemplary. The complaint was dismissed. This time the dismissal letter was accompanied by a formal notation that the allegations had been thoroughly investigated and found entirely without evidentiary support. The letter landed on Vane's desk on a Thursday morning. He read it standing because he had already put on his coat to leave for a conference and had stopped at his desk only to collect his keys. He read it once. He set it face down. His jaw did not tighten this time. His jaw was very still, which was somehow worse. He picked up his keys and left. 3 complaints, 3 investigations, 3 dismissals. And the only man who should have been diminished by this sequence was the one who kept filing. But institutions are not equipped to address the damage that comes from being accused rather than convicted, and Vane understood this. The reputational residue was never about the facts. It was about the noise. And noise, applied consistently and over time to the right ears in the right rooms, was its own kind of instrument. On the 4th floor of Hargrove Medical Center, in a corner office whose window faced the hospital's memorial garden, board chair Rowena Blackwell sat across from her executive assistant at 2:30 in the afternoon and said, "Pull the complaint file on the Hurst matter." All 3 filings. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without explanation, with the quiet precision of a woman who had been doing this job long enough to recognize a pattern when it presented itself 3 times in 3 years from the same source, aimed at the same target. Her assistant nodded and left the room without asking questions. Rowena Blackwell turned to her window and looked at the garden below, where the afternoon light fell at a sharp, clean angle through the glass, and she did not act, not yet. But she opened a file. In the neurosurgery wing, the privilege suspension had moved through the hospital the way cold air moves through a poorly sealed building, finding every gap, settling into every corner. Residents murmured about it in the break room before remembering to lower their voices. 2 senior attendings had exchanged a long look in the hallway outside the OR scheduling office that communicated everything and required no words. The schedule board had been quietly revised. The absence of Barnaby Hurst's name beside the premium case assignments was the loudest silence on the wall. Nurse Yuki Tanaka sat at the nurse's station on the surgical floor at 3:45 p.m., her charcoal scrub top precise and unwrinkled even at this hour, her black hair pinned back with the functional efficiency she applied to everything in her professional life. She was filling out a standard incident form that had nothing to do with what she was also doing, which was writing, in the back of a small black notebook she kept in the left breast pocket of her scrub top, the following: a date, a time, a location, and the names of every person present in the fourth-floor corridor. The morning Dr. Vane's voice had carried the length of the nursing station. She had been doing this since Tuesday. She had already filled 3 pages. She did not discuss it with anyone. She finished her entry, capped her pen, slid the notebook back into her pocket, and returned to the incident form without changing her expression. At 6:30 p.m., Dr. Fletcher Vane pulled his car into the driveway of the house on Aldermore Lane, a stone and cedar property with a clean, well-lit front entrance and a kitchen that his wife Diane had designed with the assistance of an architect whose day rate exceeded most monthly salaries. The kitchen was warm at this hour, overhead lights full and steady, the smell of roasted garlic and something with thyme filling the room. Diane Vane stood at the island in a cream blouse over dark jeans, draining pasta into a colander over the sink. Their son Colton sat at the kitchen table in a gray hoodie over dark joggers, his biology textbook open beside his plate, his leg bouncing with the particular restless energy of a 17-year-old whose mind was moving faster than the room around him. Vane set his bag on the counter, loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of water, and looked at his phone. "Smells good," he said, without looking up. "It's the same thing I make every Wednesday," Diane said pleasantly. Colton looked up from his textbook. "Dad, can I borrow the car Friday night? Marcus wants to drive out to the reservoir. They're doing this whole thing about the water table samples for his AP environmental project, and I told him I'd go." "What time?" Vane said. He was still looking at his phone. "Probably leave around 7. Back by 11. "Fine," Vane said. Colton nodded, returned to his textbook. Diane set a plate in front of each of them and sat down. The kitchen was warm and bright and entirely ordinary. Outside, the last of the Wednesday light was folding into evening, and the street was quiet, and nothing about this moment announced itself as anything other than what it appeared to be. A family at dinner, a father who wasn't quite present, a boy who wanted to borrow a car on Friday night. The audience already knew what Fletcher Vane did not, and the knowing sat in the chest like a stone. The clock on the trauma bay wall read 4:47 p.m. when the doors exploded open. 2 paramedics came in fast, rolling hard, the gurney's wheels screaming against the polished floor under the full blaze of overhead fluorescent light that turned everything in Hargrove Medical Center's trauma bay the same merciless white. Every shadow was burned away. Every detail was exposed. There was nowhere to hide from what was on that stretcher. 17-year-old male, unrestrained passenger, T-bone collision at Delaney and 5th, the lead paramedic called out, her voice clipped and mechanical, with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned that emotion costs seconds. Lost consciousness at the scene. GCS dropped from 9 to 6 in transport. BP is 88/54 and falling. Pupils unequal. Right is blown, left is sluggish. 1 large bore IV in. 1 liter of saline running. The trauma team moved like water, finding its level. Each person flowing to their position without collision, without instruction, without wasted motion. Monitors attached. Oxygen mask secured. The charge nurse called out vitals in a steady stream. An orderly cut through the boy's jacket with trauma shears, a blue windbreaker, gray hoodie underneath, and the fluorescent light caught the pale stillness of Colton Vane's face. 17 years old and already somewhere far away from the room that was fighting to bring him back. Dr. Fatima Diallo was at the head of the gurney before the paramedics finished their handoff. She was in her trauma scrubs, dark green top, matching trousers, stethoscope already in her ears, moving through her assessment with the focused speed of someone who had stood in this exact position hundreds of times and understood, in the marrow of her training, that speed and precision were not opposites. They were the same thing. She checked the pupils herself. Right side, fixed and dilated. Left side, barely reactive. She pressed 2 fingers along the boy's skull, her eyes moving to the monitors, calculating. Get me CT neuro. Now. And get neurosurgery on the phone. Dr. Forsyth is in OR 7, the charge nurse said. 3 hours into a 7-hour spinal reconstruction. Sterile field. Then get me his backup. The CT scan took 8 minutes. 8 minutes during which the trauma bay held itself in the tense, controlled urgency of a room that knew the score and was keeping it in real time. Blood pressure continued to drop. The right pupil did not change. Fatima stood at the imaging console when the scan populated, and she looked at it for exactly 4 seconds before she said, quietly and without drama, "There it is. Right-sided subdural hematoma, expanding rapidly." The blood was pooling between the brain and the skull, building pressure with every heartbeat, and the midline shift had already begun, the brain itself moving away from the bleed, displaced by a force it had no defense against. Fatima had seen this before. She knew what the clock said even before she ran the calculation. 6 minutes. From the point of escalation to intervention. 6 minutes before the pressure caused damage that no surgery in the world could reverse. "Where is neurosurgery?" she said. The ward clerk looked up from the phone. "Dr. Forsyth's backup is Dr. Elaine Croft. She's at a conference in Denver." I reached her assistant. Next on the list, Dr. Samuel Park. He's on bereavement leave. His father passed Monday. Next, the clerk dialed. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. The sound of it filled the space between people who already knew what voicemail meant. And when the automated greeting started, the trauma bay went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with weight. It was the quiet of a room absorbing a terrible arithmetic. Fatima did not move for 2 full seconds. Her eyes were on the CT image, the white mass of the hematoma, bright against the gray architecture of a 17-year-old brain, and her jaw was set, and her mind was moving through every option with the same systematic thoroughness that had made her the finest trauma attending at Hargrove Medical Center for 6 years running. Then she looked at the charge nurse, and the charge nurse looked at the board, and both of them arrived at the same place at the same time. One name remained. The charge nurse said it aloud, her voice careful and even. "Dr. Hurst is still in the building. 4th floor post-op." Fatima was already reaching for the phone. On the 4th floor, the overhead fluorescents ran in long parallel rows down the post-operative recovery corridor, casting the kind of clean, steady light that made every detail precise and every face readable. Dr. Barnaby Hurst stood at the nurse's station in his navy scrub top and dark dress trousers, white coat hanging open, reviewing a post-operative chart on a tablet with the same concentration he brought to everything, absolute and unhurried, as though the only thing that existed in the world was the page in front of him and the patient whose name was on it. He had been under the privilege suspension for 4 days. He had not spoken about it to anyone except Fatima. He had not called a lawyer, had not contacted a journalist, had not responded to the 17 media inquiries that had stacked up on his phone like a slow landslide. He had done rounds. He had reviewed charts. He had consulted on 3 cases within the narrow corridor his remaining privileges allowed, and he had done each one with the same focused excellence he would have brought to the most complex surgery in the hospital, because that was not performance. That was simply who he was. His pager went off at 4:58 p.m. He unclipped it from his waistband without looking away from the chart. Read the message. His eyes moved across it once with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to critical pages. Then they moved across it again. Something happened in the corridor that a camera would have needed a long, still beat to capture. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood under the fluorescent light with the pager in his hand and looked up, not at anything specific, not at anyone, just up, the way a person looks when they need a moment of ceiling and silence to hold something very large and very complicated in both hands before they decide what to do with it. It was not hesitation. The audience needed to understand that. It was not hesitation, and it was not calculation, and it was not the 3-second pause of a man deciding whether to answer a call for help. It was something else entirely. It was the pause of a man who had spent 4 days being told he was less than what he was, standing in a corridor built in part on his mother's labor, holding a page that told him the son of the man who had tried to destroy him was dying 2 floors below, and feeling, in the space between one breath and the next, the full crushing irony of the universe landing directly on his chest. Grief was in that pause, and anger, old and carefully managed, and something that might have been dark satisfaction if he had been a smaller man, which he was not, and underneath all of it, steady and immovable as the foundation of the building itself, moral clarity, not the dramatic, performed kind, the quiet, structural kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. His direct line rang. He answered on the second ring. Fatima, Barnaby. Her voice was controlled, but he knew her well enough to hear what lived underneath the control. 17-year-old male, in trauma 2, right-sided subdural hematoma, expanding fast. Midline shift started. GCS of 6 and dropping. Forsyth is in a 7-hour spinal in OR7, unreachable. Croft is in Denver. Park is on bereavement. The third backup went to voicemail. She stopped for 1 beat. It's Vane's kid. The corridor was completely silent. The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. The nurses at the station had gone still without meaning to, the way people go still when they sense that something enormous is happening just outside their ability to fully see it. One resident looked up from her notes. An orderly paused mid-step. Then Barnaby Hurst said, his voice exactly as steady as it had ever been. Which bay? 2. I need someone to pull, or 3 and get Yuki down there. Already paging her. I'm coming. He set the tablet down on the nurse's station counter with the same care he would have used if he had all the time in the world. Because that was also simply who he was. A man who did not drop things. He clipped his pager back to his waistband. He straightened his white coat. The resident who had looked up watched him move toward the stairwell door. And something in the way he moved, not fast exactly, but with a totality of purpose that made speed feel almost beside the point, made her set down her own pen and stare. He took the stairs. The double doors to Trauma 2 were heavy and gray and swung inward, and Dr. Barnaby Hurst pushed through them at 5:01 p.m., with his white coat open and his eyes already moving across the room, already reading the monitors, already building the full picture before he reached the gurney. The trauma bay was a blaze of overhead fluorescent light and controlled chaos. Fatima at the head of the bed calling out pressors, a respiratory tech repositioning the oxygen apparatus, 2 nurses moving in tight coordination around the IV lines. The monitors showed a BP of 82/49 and a heart rate that was starting to do things Barnaby Hurst did not like. And in the center of all of it, on a gurney under the flat white light, was the boy, 17 years old. Brown hair pushed back from a face that was young and slack and frighteningly still. There was a scrape along his left jaw from the accident. His hands, one visible at the edge of the sheet, were the hands of a kid, not yet a man's hands, the knuckles slightly scraped, a faded mark on the inside of his wrist that might have been a friendship bracelet tan line from the summer. He was hooked to monitors. He was breathing. Barely. Barnaby Hurst looked at him, every calculation in a mind capable of calculations that most neurosurgeons in the country could not replicate reduced itself, in that moment, to a single irreducible point. Not Vane's cruelty, not 3 dismissed complaints, not a privilege suspension sitting like a stone on his professional chest, not the years of deliberate, methodical campaign against everything he had built, not his mother mopping these floors, not his brother driving 4 hours on a Saturday with home-cooked food because the cafeteria stipend barely covered breakfast, not the elevator doors closing on Fletcher Vane's flushed, furious face. None of it. There was a child who needed a neurosurgeon. Barnaby Hurst stepped to the head of the gurney, his eyes moving to the CT images Fatima had pulled to the baize light board, and said, "Talk me through it." Fatima talked. He listened. He was already moving. The call came at 5:12 p.m. Dr. Fletcher Vane was 3 sutures from closing when his surgical assistant, Marcus, appeared at the edge of the suite with a look on his face that had nothing to do with rhinoplasty. The suite was pristine, recessed lighting overhead, Italian tile underfoot, the kind of room that made medicine look like interior design. Vane had built it that way deliberately. He believed environment communicated competence. He believed a lot of things about himself that the next 20 minutes were going to dismantle. Marcus said, "Dr. Vane," and Vane said, "Not now." Without looking up, Marcus said, "It's your son," and Vane looked up. The gloves came off before the sentence was complete. He didn't ask his assistant to finish the closure. He simply turned and walked, and his remaining team stood in the sudden silence of a room abandoned mid-sentence, which was its own kind of answer about the man. He was in the elevator at 5:14 p.m. He called Diane at 5:15. The call lasted 40 seconds, and for 38 of them, she was already crying, which told him she had already been called, which told him it was real, which told him something he had never once anticipated telling himself. He was afraid. Fletcher Vane had not been afraid in years. Fear required vulnerability, and vulnerability required the acknowledgement that something mattered more than your position in a room. His son was 17 years old and unconscious in a trauma bay 3 floors below, and the architecture of everything Fletcher Vane had built to protect himself from feeling anything cracked straight down the center without warning. He and Diane arrived at Hargrove Medical Center's surgical corridor at 5:31 p.m. She was in a gray blazer over dark jeans, her hair pulled back in the imprecise way of a woman who had dressed for a different afternoon entirely. He was still in the long-sleeve coat bearing the Hargrove Medical Center emblem across the breast pocket, the coat that had always made him feel like he owned the building. Right now it felt like a costume. Eugene Whitmore was waiting for them. The chief of staff looked the way a man looked when he had made decisions he could not unmake, and was now watching the invoice arrive. His face was ashen under the overhead fluorescent light flooding the corridor in that flat, unforgiving way that spared nothing. He wore a dark blazer over a white dress shirt, with the top button open, and his hands were clasped in front of him, in the posture of someone who had rehearsed a conversation and already knew it wasn't going to go well. Diane went to him first, her voice barely above a thread. "Where is he? Can we see him?" "He's in surgery," Eugene said. They moved quickly. The team moved very quickly." Vane stepped forward. "Who is operating on my son?" Eugene's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked briefly at the floor, then back up. "Fletcher, who is operating on my son?" The corridor went very still. An orderly 20 feet away stopped walking. A nurse at the station end found something urgent to study on her clipboard. Even the fluorescent hum seemed to pause. Eugene Whitmore said the name. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a man receiving information that his entire system refused to process on the first pass. Vane stood absolutely motionless for 2 full seconds, which was a very long time to stand motionless when you were Fletcher Vane. Then something moved across his face in sequence, visible and unstoppable, the way weather moves across open water. First, disbelief, the eyebrows fractionally raised, the mouth slightly parted. Then something uglier, a reflexive surge of the contempt that had lived in him so long it had become structural. The contempt that had authored 3 complaints and a privileged suspension and 17 years of low-grade institutional warfare. The contempt reached his face, and then it ran directly into something else entirely. Something that had no name in Fletcher Vane's emotional vocabulary because he had never needed it before. Cold, dawning horror. Not professional horror, not competitive horror. The specific horror of a father who understands, in one unguarded moment, that his son's life is in the hands of the man he spent years trying to destroy, and that there is not one single thing he can do about it except hope. Hope completely and without qualification that the man he tried to destroy is exactly as good as everyone said he was. Diane had heard the name. Her hand found Fletcher's arm. He moved toward the OR doors. A security officer, broad-shouldered, light gray uniform shirt tucked into dark trousers, radio clipped at the shoulder, stepped into his path with the quiet authority of someone who had done this before. "Sir, I can't let you past those doors. I'm a physician at this hospital." Vane's voice came out harder than he intended, which meant it came out exactly the way it always did. "I have active credentials. You're a family member in this instance, sir. That's the protocol. I know the protocol. I helped write the Fletcher." Diane's voice was quiet and absolute. She had her hand through his arm now, and the pressure of it was not gentle. "Stop." He stopped. The security officer directed them to the observation corridor, a long, clean hallway running parallel to OR 3, lit by the same relentless overhead fluorescence, with a wide rectangular window that looked down into the surgical theater below. It was a window designed for medical students and attending residents learning from a distance. It was not designed for fathers. Fletcher Vane had walked past that corridor 1,000 times in his career and never once thought about what it meant to stand on the outside of the glass looking in. He understood it now. Diane pressed both palms flat against the glass before she had fully stopped walking, leaning into it the way people lean into cold air when they can't breathe. Below them, under brilliant surgical lighting that turned the theater into something almost celestial, white and precise and absolute, a team moved in the coordinated silence of a well-run room, and at the center of it, scrubbed and capped, magnifying loupes positioned over his eyes, stood Dr. Barnaby Hurst. His hands were moving. His hands were completely, utterly, inhumanly steady. Inside OR 3, the temperature of the room had nothing to do with fear. Dr. Barnaby Hurst had entered a state that other surgeons described in interviews and case studies, but could rarely reproduce on demand. It was not calm, exactly. Calm implied the absence of pressure. What Barnaby inhabited in moments like this was something more structural, a compression of every distraction, every external variable, every biographical fact about himself and everyone else in the room, until the only remaining reality was the patient on the table and the precise sequence of actions required to keep them there. The boy's name was Colton. He was 17. He had a right-sided subdural hematoma, with midline shift already in progress when Barnaby scrubbed in, and the 6-minute neurological window had been a courtesy the situation was no longer offering. What he had now was skill and a clear field and a team that knew how to follow him. He had Yuki Tanaka. She stood directly across the table from him in full surgical attire, scrub top, cap, gloved, and she did not wait for requests. She had worked beside Barnaby Hurst for 4 years, and in that time she had developed a form of surgical fluency that most teams took a decade to build. When his hand moved 2 degrees toward the left, she had already adjusted. When his breathing changed in a way that was invisible to everyone else in the room, she understood what it meant and was already preparing for the next step. They were not performing a surgery. They were solving a problem together in real time, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. Barnaby's interior monologue was clean and linear. He noted the hematoma's expansion, contained now, evacuation proceeding at the rate he had targeted. He noted the boy's BP stabilizing under the anesthesiologist's watch. He noted the midline shift reversing, slowly, measurably, in the way that meant the pressure on the brain was releasing and the window for damage was contracting. Good. He noted all of it and filed it and kept moving. There was one moment, only one, when something other than pure clinical focus entered his mind. It came between the third and fourth instrument pass, just a fraction of a second, not long enough to register as a thought exactly, more like an image. The elevator doors closing, the fluorescent-lit hallway, veins flushed, furious face growing smaller. Barnaby Hurst pushed the image away with the same controlled exhale he had used in that hallway. In, out, gone. The boy on the table had nothing to do with any of that. The boy on the table had a brain that needed a neurosurgeon, and there was only one neurosurgeon available. And the only question worth asking was whether he was going to do his job. He was doing his job. At the observation window, Diane Vane was crying without sound, the tears moving down her face in the unhurried way of someone who had stopped managing their expression and simply surrendered to what was happening. Her palms were still flat against the glass. She was watching the surgeon's hands with a focus that was almost devotional, tracking every movement, every adjustment, searching for reassurance in the precision of a stranger's craft. Fletcher Vane stood one step behind her. He had not moved since they arrived at the window. He had not spoken. His hands were at his sides, and the Hargrove Medical Center emblem on his coat caught the corridor light in a way he was not aware of and would not have noticed regardless, because Fletcher Vane was not thinking about his coat or his credentials or his complaints or his campaign. He was not thinking about medical school or competitive advantage, or the careful architecture of professional sabotage he had constructed and maintained over 17 years. He was watching Barnaby Hurst's hands. There was an expression on his face that his surgical assistant had never seen. His patients had never seen it. His wife had not seen it in years. It was the expression of a man stripped of every defense mechanism at once, not by argument, not by confrontation, not by any force he could have prepared for or positioned against, but by the simple, devastating reality of watching the person he had tried to diminish do something extraordinary. No contempt lived in Fletcher Vane's face in that moment. There was no room for it. The fear had displaced everything else, and beneath the fear, barely visible, something else had begun to move, something raw and formless that had not yet become a feeling with a name. It was not guilt, not yet. It was the precursor to guilt. The moment just before the mirror forces recognition, the instant when the story you have told yourself about who you are and why you do what you do begins to develop cracks that no new complaint filing, no administrative maneuver, no careful reframing can paper over. The man on the other side of that glass was the only thing standing between Fletcher Vane and the worst moment of his life. And that man's hands did not shake. They had never shaken. Not once. Not in the elevator. Not after 3 investigations. Not after a privilege suspension designed to reduce him to nothing. Not in OR3 on a Thursday evening with the son of his enemy on the table and the weight of every injustice he had absorbed sitting somewhere behind his sternum where it had no business being while he worked. Diane pressed her forehead against the glass. Below them, under that brilliant, unforgiving surgical light, Dr. Barnaby Hurst adjusted his loops a fraction of a degree, accepted an instrument from Yuki Tanaka's waiting hand, and continued. The first incision came at 6:04 p.m. The OR was brilliant white, under surgical lighting so precise and total that shadows had nowhere to live. Every surface reflected clarity. Every instrument caught the light and threw it back. This was not a room where uncertainty was permitted to breathe, and Dr. Barnaby Hurst moved through it the way a man moves through a space he has built inside his mind 10,000 times before he ever walked into it physically. He wore surgical scrubs, the pale green of Hargrove's OR standard, with a cap fitted low, and his magnifying loupes seated across the bridge of his nose. The loupes gave him a world 6 times closer than anyone else in that room could see. They gave him the boy's brain as a landscape, and the landscape had a problem, and the problem had a solution, and the solution required his hands to be absolutely still. His hands were absolutely still. "Retractor," he said. Yuki Tanaka had it moving toward him before the second syllable landed. That was the nature of their shorthand, built across 4 years and more than 200 surgeries together. She did not watch the tray when he worked. She watched him. She read the angle of his head, the micro adjustments of his shoulders, the way his breathing shifted in the seconds before a decision crystallized. She was the instrument of his anticipation, and she had never once been wrong about what he needed. He accepted the retractor without looking away from the field. The craniotomy was complete. The bone flap was set aside, with the careful respect a craftsman gives a component he will need again. The dura was open, and what lay beneath it was exactly what the CT had shown: a right-sided subdural hematoma, dark and dense, and pressing the boy's brain with the patient, indifferent persistence of accumulated blood. The midline shift was real. The 6-minute window that had organized the entire emergency was already behind them, but behind it now was something else: Barnaby Hurst, and time, and the arithmetic of surgical precision. "How's his pressure?" he asked without looking up. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Reeves, answered from behind his screen, "Holding at 88/60, stable from 3 minutes ago. Let me know the second it trends." Copy. Barnaby Hurst began the evacuation. He thought in images when he operated, not in words. The language of surgery was spatial, dimensional, a constant 3-dimensional calculation of what lay millimeters beyond what he could see, what the tissue was doing that it wasn't showing him yet, what the monitors were telling him in the cadence of their numbers before the numbers changed. He thought about the boy the way he thought about every patient, as a system he was responsible for, as a life whose continuation was currently a function of his training and his focus, and the absolute refusal of his hands to do anything other than exactly what was required. He did not think about Fletcher Vane. He evacuated methodically. The hematoma came away in careful increments, the suction working with surgical patience, the surgical field revealing itself with each pass. 6 minutes in, the brain began to show the first signs of pressure relief. Subtle, barely perceptible, but Barnaby Hurst perceived it. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something Yuki Tanaka recognized as acknowledgement, and she adjusted the light angle by 2 degrees without being asked. Outside the OR doors, in the observation corridor above, Diane Vane had stopped crying. She was pressed against the glass with both hands flat against it, as if the act of pressing hard enough might let her touch her son. Her gray blazer was wrinkled now, one collar edge turned in on itself. She had been standing in the same position for 40 minutes, and she had moved only once, when she reached sideways and grabbed her husband's arm, and he had let her hold it, and he had not moved either. Fletcher Vane stood very still. This was not the stillness of the surgeon below him. It was a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a man who has walked into a room and found every wall closer than he remembered. He was still in his long-sleeve coat, bearing the Hargrove Medical Center emblem, the fabric pulling slightly at the shoulders from how rigidly he held himself. His eyes had not left the operating table. More precisely, they had not left the hands working above it, the hands he had spent 3 years trying to discredit, The hands that had never once, in any documentation, complaint, or investigation, been found to be anything other than what they were. Exceptional, he thought about the letter. The privilege suspension, the conversations with Eugene Whitmore in the doctor's lounge, the careful framing, the patient accumulation of institutional leverage. He thought about the first complaint, how certain he had been that it would finally land. He thought about Whitmore's face this evening in the corridor when he had said the name. He stopped thinking about all of it, because none of it had any purchase against what he was watching. Eugene Whitmore arrived at 7:22 p.m. He came to the observation area quietly, which was unusual for a man who generally entered spaces as if he intended to manage them. He wore a dark suit, the jacket buttoned, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He stood at the back of the observation area and said nothing to either of the Vanes. He looked through the glass, and what he saw arranged itself into a meaning he had been avoiding for some time. The surgery was 81 minutes old. Barnaby Hurst was working with the same focused precision he had brought to the first minute of it. No fatigue in his posture, no hesitation in his movements. The residents who worked with him sometimes said, quietly, among themselves, that Dr. Hurst operated the way a concert pianist played, not note by note, but in complete continuous thought. The technical and the interpretive fused into something that didn't look like effort because it had long since transcended effort. Whitmore had suspended this man's privileges 4 days ago. He set his jaw and looked at the floor for one moment, and then he looked back at the glass. Rowena Blackwell arrived at 8:09 p.m. She came from the end of the corridor, still in the clothes she'd worn to the late board meeting, a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, low heels that made no sound on the floor. Her assistant had found her in the conference room reviewing quarterly budget projections and had said exactly 7 words, "Dr. Hurst is in surgery, Vane's son." She had closed the budget file without responding, risen without explanation, and walked. She stood at the far end of the observation window and did not announce herself to Vane or to Whitmore. She looked through the glass, and her expression gave away nothing, and she did not speak, and she did not leave. Inside the OR, at 8:31 p.m., the room changed. It was a sound first, a tone shift in the monitors, a sustained note that climbed 2 registers in 3 seconds. Then Dr. Reeves's voice, controlled but immediate. Pressure dropping, 64/40 and falling. Barnaby Hurst did not look up from the field. "Where are we on volume?" Pushed 2 units. Still dropping. The room recalibrated without drama. That was the thing about a team that had trained together. The response to crisis was not louder, it was quieter. Everyone moved with more precision and less noise. The scrub tech positioned herself without being told. Yuki Tanaka's eyes moved to Barnaby Hurst and stayed there. Then he saw it, a bleeder. It had opened without warning near the sagittal sinus, the major venous structure running along the top of the brain, the one you could not nick, could not crowd, could not address imprecisely without consequences that changed a young man's life in ways that could not be undone. It was not gushing, it was seeping with the quiet, insistent purpose of water finding a crack in stone, and in the terrain where it was located, quiet and insistent was enough. 4-O-proline, Barnaby Hurst said. His voice was the same as it had been when he asked for the retractor. Yuki Tanaka had it in his hand in 4 seconds. What happened next lasted 43 seconds, and no one in the room breathed through all of them. He worked at the edge of the sinus with the suture and a patience so concentrated it was almost physical in its presence. The bleed was in a location that forgave nothing. The suture had to hold without constricting, had to address the source without disturbing the surrounding tissue, had to be placed with a confidence so absolute that confidence itself became technique. His loops gave him the world at 6 times magnification. His hands gave him control at a scale smaller than most surgeons ever trained to reach. The monitors climbed their bad tone. The anesthesiologist pushed another unit. Barnaby Hurst placed the suture. He placed it again. He held 43 seconds. The bleed stopped. It stopped the way bleeds stop when addressed correctly. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a progressive settling quietude that traveled from the surgical field up through the room and reached the monitors last. The tone eased. Dr. Reeves said, "Pressure coming up, 71/50, climbing." And then, 15 seconds later, 80/55, holding. Barnaby Hurst exhaled once through his nose. The anesthesiologist exhaled audibly enough that the scrub tech almost smiled. Yuki Tanaka's shoulders dropped exactly 1 centimeter, and then she was ready again. In the observation corridor, Diane Vane made a sound that was not quite a word and pressed her forehead against the glass. Fletcher Vane's grip on the window frame tightened until his knuckles went pale, and then he released it slowly, and he looked at his wife, and for a moment something crossed his face that had nothing to do with Barnaby Hurst, and everything to do with the realization of what almost just happened in a room he had no power over. Rowena Blackwell, at the far end of the window, watched. She said nothing. She was filing things. She had a methodical mind, and it was working, and the picture it was assembling had a clarity she could not look away from. Whitmore stood at the back and looked at his hands. The surgery continued for another hour and 9 minutes. Barnaby Hurst worked through it with the same locked-in, total attention he had brought to every prior minute. The hematoma fully evacuated. The pressure on the brain eased to the point where the tissue began to show the faint, unmistakable resilience of recovery. The bone flap was replaced. The fixation was precise. The closure came layer by layer, each one its own small act of restoration, the body being handed back to itself in the condition it had been promised. At 9:44 p.m., the last suture went in. Barnaby Hurst straightened. He stepped back from the table with the careful, measured movement of a man who has been very close to something important for a very long time. He reached up and pushed his loops onto his forehead, and he looked at the boy, 17 years old, chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of assisted breathing that would, within hours, give way to breathing of his own. Monitors reading in the stable ranges, skin color returning, a brain restored to its rightful space inside a skull that now held the evidence of a surgical technique that would belong permanently in this young man's file. Proof that the right person had been in the right room at the right time. Barnaby Hurst looked at the boy for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at his team, Yuki Tanaka, Dr. Reeves, the scrub tech, the circulating nurse, and he said, "Good work, everyone." That was all. He stripped his gloves and positioned the post-op dictation recorder at the edge of the surgical field. His voice, when he spoke into it, was even and technical and complete. He did not abbreviate. He did not rush. He described every decision, every complication, every response, every resolution, the way a surgeon describes a surgery, with the precision of a man who understands that his words will be read by other physicians long after this night is over. And those physicians deserve accuracy. He was still dictating when the observation corridor went quiet above him, and the people standing at the glass began, one by one, to turn and walk away. He did not look up to see who was left. He already knew the only one who mattered. The boy was breathing. The overhead fluorescents in the surgical corridor of Hargrove Medical Center do not dim at night. They never do. They hum at the same unwavering frequency at 9 in the evening as they do at 9 in the morning, casting the same clean, unsparing light on everything beneath them. The polished floor tiles, the empty gurneys parked flush against the walls, the institutional sameness of a building that does not pause to acknowledge what has just happened inside it. It was 9:17 p.m. on a Thursday, and the corridor was the quietest place in the hospital. Dr. Barnaby Hurst came through the OR wing doors like a man who had done what he set out to do and needed nothing from the world as a result. He wore clean scrubs, a gray top over navy trousers, the collar damp at the back of his neck, the fabric carrying the faint antiseptic residue of 3 hours and 40 minutes in a surgical theater. He walked without urgency, without theater, his hands loose at his sides. His loops were folded and clipped to his breast pocket. His white coat was somewhere in the locker room. He had left it there deliberately, the way a man leaves behind anything he no longer needs. He saw Fletcher Vane from 30 feet away. Vane was standing just outside the recovery wing entrance, his back to the wall, arms not quite crossed, one hand gripping the opposite elbow in the posture of a man who has been arguing with himself for hours and has not yet reached a verdict. He had changed out of his Hargrove emblazoned coat at some point. He wore a white dress shirt, collar open, sleeves rolled to the forearms with the distracted imprecision of someone who stopped caring about his appearance the moment his son went unconscious. His face under the fluorescent light looked stripped of everything that usually lived there. The practiced confidence, the controlled contempt, the particular expression he wore in corridors when he wanted people to know he owned them. All of it was gone. What remained was something rawer and older than Fletcher Vane had ever allowed anyone to see. He had sent Diane to sit with Colton. The boy was stable, vitals excellent, prognosis as good as Barnaby Hurst had made it. Diane had not left that bedside since they wheeled Colton in, and Vane had looked at her through the recovery room window for a long time before turning and walking back here, back to this corridor. Back to wait. He watched Barnaby Hurst come toward him, and something moved across his face that was not quite recognition, because he had always known who Barnaby Hurst was. It was closer to confrontation, the specific vertigo of seeing a truth you have been outrunning suddenly standing directly in your path with nowhere left to turn. Barnaby Hurst stopped 6 feet away, not close enough for intimacy, not far enough for distance. He looked at Vane with an expression that was quiet and level and entirely unreadable to anyone who did not know him, and completely transparent to anyone who did. He was not angry. He had made his peace with Fletcher Vane a long time ago, in the way that you make peace with weather. You do not love it, you do not forgive it, but you stop giving it more space in your mind than it deserves. Vane opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the floor, and then back up. He tried again. His jaw worked briefly around words that would not form. The third attempt produced something. You didn't have to be the one to do it. His voice came out lower than it usually did, the manufactured authority stripped out of it, leaving something that sounded almost human. Barnaby Hurst looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light caught the stillness of his face. The corridor hummed its even, indifferent hum. "I know," Barnaby Hurst said. He moved to walk past. His footsteps were steady on the polished floor. He had gone perhaps 4 paces when Vane said his name. Not Dr. Hurst, not the clipped professional address that had always carried a faint edge of mockery when Vane used it. Just the name, Barnaby, in a voice that sounded like a man standing at the edge of something he did not know how to cross. Barnaby Hurst stopped. He did not turn. The corridor held its breath. "Why?" Vane asked. The word came out short and stripped bare, carrying more weight than a single syllable should have been able to hold. It was not a question about medicine or protocol or professional obligation. They both understood that. It was the real question, the only one that had ever mattered between them, asked at last from a place that had nothing left to hide behind. Barnaby Hurst turned. He looked at Fletcher Vane, and what he saw was a man who had spent years constructing the idea that someone else's excellence was a threat to his own, who had filed 3 complaints, engineered a suspension, whispered in corridors and offices and boardrooms, and who was standing now in the wreckage of all of it with nothing but the truth of what had just happened to show him exactly who both of them were. When Barnaby Hurst spoke, his voice was quiet. It was not gentle, and it was not harsh. It was simply true, the way surgical findings are true, clear, unambiguous, arrived at by precision, because that's what I trained for, because that's what I'm here for, and because your son had nothing to do with you and me. He held Vane's gaze for exactly as long as it took to be certain the words had landed. Then he turned, and he walked away, and Fletcher Vane did not call after him again. Some verdicts do not require a gavel. The nurse's station on the neurosurgery floor was lit by the overhead panels and the glow of computer monitors when Barnaby Hurst settled into the chair behind the documentation terminal. He pulled up Colton Vane's surgical record and began his post-op notes with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, each notation precise and complete, the kind of documentation that would hold up under any review because it was simply accurate. Around him, the night shift moved with its particular quiet efficiency, lower voices, faster steps, the hospital reducing itself to its essential functions while the rest of the world slept. He was on the third page of his notes when the chair across from him was pulled out and occupied. Rowena Blackwell sat down without ceremony. She was still in the clothes she had worn to the board meeting earlier that evening, a dark blazer over a slate gray blouse, reading glasses pushed up into her silver-threaded hair. She set her hands flat on the desk surface and looked at Barnaby Hurst with the particular expression of a woman who has been doing this job long enough to know exactly what she has witnessed and exactly what it demands of her. She did not congratulate him. She did not comment on the surgery or the outcome or the extraordinary nature of what had occurred in OR2 that night. Rowena Blackwell was not a sentimental woman, and she understood that Barnaby Hurst was not a man who needed sentiment from her. What he needed from her was something far more concrete. "I'll be calling an emergency board session first thing in the morning," she said. Her voice was even and certain, the voice of institutional authority being deployed in exactly the way it was designed to be used. 7:30. I want every relevant file on the table before 8. Barnaby Hurst nodded. His eyes did not leave the screen. His fingers kept moving across the keys. "I'll have my surgical report finalized tonight," he said. "I know you will," Rowena Blackwell said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she pushed back her chair, stood, and walked down the corridor in the direction of the administrative wing, her footsteps precise and unhurried. The overhead lights held everything in the same unwavering clarity they always did. Barnaby Hurst kept writing. He was nearly finished when he heard the soft placement of a mug on the desk beside his keyboard. He glanced up. Nurse Yuki Tanaka stood there in her OR scrubs, still in her surgical cap, her expression carrying the quiet steadiness it always did. The face of someone who has worked beside excellence long enough to recognize it instinctively and does not require drama to honor it. She had placed a cup of black coffee next to his notes. She met his eyes briefly and gave a single small nod before moving back toward the medication station with the efficiency that had made her the finest head OR nurse in the building for 11 years running. Barnaby Hurst wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth moved through his palms, through the long fingers that had, 3 hours ago, held a suture in the near vicinity of a 17-year-old sagittal sinus, and brought him back from the far edge. He drank slowly and returned to his documentation. He was signing the final page of his post-op notes when movement at the far end of the corridor caught the edge of his vision. Dr. Fatima Diallo stood at the corridor's end, 40 feet away, still in her trauma scrubs. Dark green top, charcoal trousers, a dried coffee stain on her left sleeve from what had probably been a very long day that started somewhere around 7 that morning. She had not changed. She had not gone home. She stood at the end of that long, fluorescent-lit hallway and looked at Barnaby Hurst across the distance. And then she raised her right fist, not high, not dramatically, just to chest height, steady and certain and absolute. It was the kind of gesture that does not require volume to be heard across a room. It was the language of people who have stood in the same difficult places and understood each other without explanation. A salute that carried everything a standing ovation would have carried, and none of the noise. Barnaby Hurst looked at her from across that corridor, and something shifted in his face. Not the controlled composure of the man in the elevator this morning, not the surgical focus of the man in OR2 3 hours ago. Something quieter and more private than either of those. The particular expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been reminded, without fanfare, that they were never carrying it alone. He raised his fist back. Same height, same steadiness. They held it for a moment. Two people at opposite ends of a hospital corridor under fluorescent light at 9:30 at night. And then Fatima Diallo lowered her hand, turned, and walked in the direction of the trauma wing, where there were always more patients, always more work, always another hour demanding everything she had. Barnaby Hurst lowered his hand. He looked at the completed post-op notes on the screen in front of him. He looked at the mug of cooling coffee. He looked at the corridor, empty now, humming with its steady institutional light. The same corridor his mother had mopped on early morning shifts before he was old enough to carry his own backpack. The same building, the same light, a completely different position in it. He closed the file. He logged out of the terminal. He picked up the mug and finished the last of the coffee and set it back down with care. Then Dr. Barnaby Hurst stood up, straightened the gray top of his scrubs, and walked toward the locker room to retrieve his white coat. In approximately 10 hours, a board would convene. Files would be opened. Records would be presented. Yuki Tanaka's documentation would sit on that table like a receipt. The institution would be asked to account for itself. But that was morning. Tonight, there was a boy in recovery who was going to wake up and ask for his phone. Tonight, there was a corridor that had witnessed something it would not soon exhaust the meaning of. Tonight, there was only the walk, unhurried, undefeated, the footsteps of a man who had never needed the storm to stop to know exactly who he was inside it. The overhead fluorescents hummed their even hum. His hands did not shake. They never did. 72 hours after Dr. Barnaby Hurst walked out of OR3 with steady hands and a living boy behind him, the Hargrove Medical Center boardroom, filled with morning light so clean and white it felt deliberate. The conference room was glass-walled on 3 sides, and the Sunday skylight poured in without apology, flooding every surface, leaving nowhere to hide. Board chair Rowena Blackwell stood at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her reading glasses on, a binder open in front of her that she had clearly already memorized. She did not look like someone who had called an emergency session reluctantly. She looked like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, with the patience of a woman who understood that justice, real justice, has its own clock. She opened without preamble. She laid out the 3 complaints first, each one filed by the same physician, each one timed, as Dr. Fatima Diallo's meticulous records now confirmed, to land within days of Dr. Barnaby Hurst's most visible surgical achievements. The first complaint, alleging falsified outcome reports, dismissed after 2 independent attendings verified every figure. The second, alleging improper consultation conduct, dismissed after the patient wrote a personal letter to this very board praising Dr. Hurst in terms that left no ambiguity. The third and most vicious, claiming he had operated while impaired, dismissed after toxicology, surgical footage, and 6 witness statements reduced the allegation to nothing. Rowena Blackwell read each dismissal notation aloud, her voice even, her eyes moving once to Eugene Whitmore, who sat 3 seats down the table in a gray dress shirt, collar slightly too tight, hands folded on the surface in a way that suggested he was holding himself together by force of will. Fletcher Vane was not in the room. He had submitted a written recusal the evening before. 1 page, no explanation beyond the legal minimum. Rowena Blackwell had read it, noted it, and moved on. She placed Nurse Yuki Tanaka's documentation on record next. 41 pages of time-stamped entries, every hallway confrontation, every witnessed remark, every instance where the pattern became undeniable in the hands of someone disciplined enough to write it all down. Then she placed the surgical record from Thursday night, the craniotomy, the bleeder, the stabilization, the post-op notes completed before Dr. Hurst had even changed out of his scrubs, and finally, a formal written statement from Dr. Damian Forsyth, still recovering from a 14-hour operative day, confirming in unambiguous clinical language that on the evening in question he was unreachable, that the backup list had been exhausted, and that Dr. Barnaby Hurst was the only neurosurgeon in the building. The vote was not close. Full surgical privileges reinstated. A formal letter of record placed in Dr. Hurst's permanent file, not as a notation of discipline, but as a notation of vindication. His name restored, his standing at Hargrove Medical Center elevated to a level that Vane's years of erosion had never actually reached. Eugene Whitmore was placed on administrative review for bypassing the independent cause review protocol required before any privilege suspension. Rowena Blackwell filed a formal inquiry into the pattern of malicious complaints, a process that would unfold in the months ahead with the unhurried certainty of institutional weight finally applied in the right direction. She closed her binder. She looked at the room. She said, "This board does not move slowly when it finally moves." No one responded. No one needed to. Dr. Barnaby Hurst was not in the boardroom. He was already in the neurosurgery wing. He had arrived at 7:30 a.m. in a pressed white coat over a navy scrub top and dark charcoal trousers, the overhead fluorescence catching the clean line of his shoulders as he moved through the corridor with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never actually lost his footing, only been forced to demonstrate how well he could hold it. His first stop was not his office. It was room 412. Colton Vane was awake, 17 years old, a fading bruise along his left temple, an IV line in his right arm, and the slightly bewildered expression of someone whose brain had been through a war it barely remembered. He was asking a nurse about his phone when Barnaby Hurst stepped in. The examination was thorough and quiet. Pupils equal and reactive. Grip strength returning on both sides. Verbal responses clear. Barnaby Hurst checked each baseline with the same focused attention he gave every patient in every room. The same attention he had given Colton on Thursday when the boy was unconscious and his father was on the other side of a glass window, being undone by consequence. Colton watched him with the open curiosity of someone too young and too recently injured to perform anything. He asked, "Who are you?" Barnaby Hurst looked up from the chart. "The doctor who operated on you." Colton was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "Thank you." Barnaby Hurst said, "Rest." He wrote a note in the chart, replaced it, and walked out. Fletcher Vane was in the hallway. He was standing beside Diane, who had not left the hospital for more than a few hours in 3 days. She looked exhausted in the way only relief can make a person look, as though her body was only now understanding that it was allowed to be tired. Fletcher Vane was in a dark jacket over a white button-down shirt, and he looked like a man who had stood at an observation window for 3 hours and watched something happen to him that no medical degree had prepared him for. He saw Barnaby Hurst come through the door. He said nothing for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Barnaby Hurst looked at it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has every right to refuse and chooses, with full understanding of that right, to accept on his own terms. He shook it, not warmly, not coldly, with the measured, bone-deep dignity that had defined him from the moment he stood at an elevator on a sun-drenched Monday and did not flinch at a man screaming his intentions across a hallway. The handshake lasted 2 seconds. Neither man spoke. Some debts cannot be named. Some wounds close without ceremony, and the closing is enough. Barnaby Hurst walked away down the corridor toward OR4. The case had been assigned that morning, the first premium neurosurgical case listed under his reinstated privileges. His team was already assembled when he pushed through the doors, the overhead surgical lights blazing white and absolute, the room smelling of antiseptic and precision, and everything he had worked for since he was 18 years old, walking corridors his mother mopped, telling himself he would belong here. He belonged here. Yuki Tanaka was across the table, already in position, already reading him the way she had for years, the way only a great surgical nurse reads a great surgeon. In the silence before the first incision, when everything is potential and nothing is yet irreversible, she held out the first instrument without being asked. He took it. His hands were steady under the light. They were always steady. They had never, in the full and documented history of Dr. Barnaby Hurst's hands, been anything other than steady. That was the truth Vane spent years trying to bury, and the reason it never stayed buried. You cannot keep underground what was always meant to save lives. He began. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.